are jumping on for our Lesson 8 PowerPoint lecture. This is on the Tang Dynasty, but also on the philosophy of Taoism. And I sort of decided to combine these into one lecture because in our Unshoaled text, during the he talks about the Taoism and he talks about the development of herbal medicine and herbal drug therapy in China and the influence that Taoism has on that development. So I thought it would be a good idea to use the Taoism and the herbal medicine development period as a great time and place to also talk about the Tang Dynasty, which comes after our last lesson, the Han Dynasty. It's probably the next sort of important period of Chinese history to overview. So that's what we're going to be talking about this lesson, Taoism and the Tang Dynasty and the influences that this period and this philosophy has on East Asian medicine. So let's jump into our presentation. So just as a brief overview, the history of the period that we're talking about after the Han Dynasty. Once again, the imperial dynasty of the Han Dynasty falls and disintegrates. There's another period of chaos, sort of similar to the Warring States period, but on a lesser scale. And then there's an emergence of new competition to become the hegemonic power of the time. And eventually there's a dynasty called the Tang Dynasty, which emerges. We're going to be talking about some of the important doctors and texts from this time period. We're going to talk a little bit about the basics of philosophical Taoism, which is to be differentiated from maybe the sort of religious oriented Taoism, which is more of like the demonological concepts and the magical concepts and some of the Wu shamanism ideas. They persist in a sort of more religious oriented Taoism, and so they can sometimes be differentiated, and we're mostly concerned here in our lecture with the philosophical ideas of Taoism as a philosophy, not so much as a religion or some kind of shamanic practice. But we're also going to be talking about some of the important concepts of philosophical Taoism, such as Wu Wei, Zuran, Tao, the ideas of harmony, and others. And we're going to talk about how Taoism relates to the development of herbal medicine in East Asian medicine, and that's one of the main topics of our text this week. And we're also going to talk about other ways that Taoist concepts are applied to medicine, such as ideas of Jing or practices of Yang Sheng or Qi Gong or other sorts of similar things. You know, that involves like meditation practices and movement and breath work and things of that nature. And just to note, these two ways of writing Taoism are the same thing. They are just different transliterations of the same word. So sometimes when you turn a Chinese word into English, there are different ways to express that in the English language, and sometimes the T's and D's get interchanged depending on the way that you're transliterating the words. So that's just something to be aware of, just in case I use one or the other at different times in the lecture. So at the fall of the Han Dynasty, this is a time period where once again there's a state of chaos that emerges, and this event weakened the political and social standing of Confucianism for a short period of time in Chinese society. This is also when a period when Buddhism is starting to come and become an aspect of Chinese culture and Chinese society that's coming from India. And so the beginnings of Buddhism start to come into China sort of during the Han Dynasty, but especially now towards the end of the Han Dynasty. They spread through China during the Han Dynasty from India. So Buddhism starting to come in. And during the Sui Dynasty, which is a very short dynasty between the Han and the Tang Dynasty, the Sui Dynasty is a period where Buddhism gets embraced, actually. It's embraced for political unification purposes. And during the Sui Dynasty, it also eventually falls under the weight of things like excessive war, demanding civil service and hard labor, taxation. So these are the kinds of things that bring down the Sui Dynasty. It doesn't last terribly long. And just for the record, this is kind of now where we are in our progression of the dynastic timelines of China. So in our last lectures, we were spending a lot of time up in these periods, and then you have this time of chaos. This is what I'm talking about after the fall of the Han Dynasty. There's some new periods of chaos and vying for power for quite a few hundred years. It's about 400 years basically from the period of the end of the Han Dynasty to where we are now going to be talking about in the Tang Dynasty. So all this chaos is happening, vying for power, different powerful periods and dynasties, and then the Sui Dynasty for a short period, and then that falls, and now you have the Tang Dynasty, and this is the next period of really like consolidation of power and like peace for a long time, and a long period of dynastic rule. So we're looking at the Tang Dynasty here. That's where we are now. So a little bit about the Tang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty, much like the Han Dynasty, is often considered another golden age of Chinese history. China, at this point, it's in contact with a lot of the other major world civilizations, and it becomes a very cosmopolitan empire. There's a vibrant multicultural pluralism. There's a lot of trade, especially through like the Silk Road, which is a thing that's going on right now, which is the trade routes that run from China through India and even further into the west towards Europe and towards Rome and those kinds of places. And it's also a time of like lots of ideas are being spread around. There's a lot of syncretism happening. It's a somewhat laissez-faire period of time compared to maybe like other periods in Chinese history, which can be more authoritarian or very, very conservative. And that's because of the emergence of a Taoist inspired government during the Tang Dynasty. There's more ideas of Taoism, there's influences of Buddhism, and these are all mixing together to create these kinds of political environments at the time. It's not as conservative because maybe Confucianism has lost a little bit of its overwhelming force in the government. But still, despite that, Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, as philosophies, are all somewhat syncretically combining and prominent within the minds of the people of the time. It's really a time period where all of these ideas are mixing together. It's a very rich and vibrant period of time to live in China. It's probably, I would imagine it's probably one of the coolest times to have lived in ancient China, frankly. Um, the Tang eventually they seek to suppress Buddhism and confiscate monasterial wealth. This is something that happens during the Tang Dynasty because they see it as a powerful, rich institutional force which is untaxed. Buddhism to them at some point becomes seen as like a subversive foreign adulteration of Taoism. And Confucians also react to Buddhism because to Confucians, Buddhism is undermining their administrative monopoly within like the state bureaucracy. So this just exemplifies the philosophical tensions, the struggles, the ideological vying for power over the politics of the state that involves these philosophies. So it's not all hunky dory. They're not all necessarily on the same page. They come to very different conclusions about how things should be run, how life should be, how the state should be run, basic fundamental things about the world, and they all come to different conclusions, and they have different solutions that they suggest. So they aren't all on the same page, but at the same time, I imagine as like a normal person in the world during a period like the Tang Dynasty, you're probably still being influenced from ideas from all three of these. It's a very syncretic time. And we're going to be talking more about Buddhism in the next lesson specifically, so we'll save that mostly. When it comes to contributions to medicine, the Tang Dynasty does make some contributions, like the dynasty itself. So they established an official state medical bureau. So this is kind of like the first time that really medicine becomes institutionalized and part of government policy in China. Um, Specifically, they elevate the Shanghanlun as a book, as a text, as a theory. The theories of the Shanghanlun, they become very prominent during the Tang Dynasty. It's generally becomes considered a classic, much like the Neijing and the Nanjing and those classic books of pre-Han and Han Dynasty. Also, the Shanghanlun is now kind of considered a classic, especially for herbal medicine doctors. It becomes one of the most important herbal medicine texts, and we'll see that, for instance, when we look at Sun Sumiao. He is someone who's very influenced by the Shanghanlun, I would imagine. And also during the Tang Dynasty, there's sort of like the formal creation of like specialized medical fields. So you get people who are practicing pediatrics, you get people who are practicing obstetrics, et cetera, et cetera. You know, various specialties in medicine. They sort of become differentiated a little bit in the Tang Dynasty. And this is also seen in Sun Sumiao's work, where he does have specific writings on pediatrics, specific writings on obstetrics. Speaking of the Silk Road, it's just an important period of time where there's a lot of cross-cultural influences that spread and influence East Asian medicine, like Buddhism, for instance, but also ideas perhaps from other cultures, even like maybe there's contact with like some Islamic cultures, or maybe there's contact with even other East Asian cultures, or there's contact even further with in small ways with perhaps like other civilizations like Rome, even, because it was a pretty cosmopolitan, very global culture. They were a big power in the world, and you have to understand that at this period of time in world history, China is perhaps like the most powerful, biggest empire in the world. And in here in the West, we speak about Rome a lot, and further back we speak about the Greek period. But really, a lot of times we don't give as much credit to China as maybe is due. China is a huge power in world history at this period, between the Han Dynasty, between the Tang Dynasty, and even further during maybe like the Song Dynasty, which we're going to talk about later. It's an extremely populated empire. They have a huge population. They're very powerful. They're very wealthy, and have a very advanced culture. So it's just worth noting that China at this period of time is a very advanced civilization. So just a couple important Tang Dynasty doctors that are important to know. We have number one, Sun Sumiao. He's probably the most important. He actually lived during the Sui Dynasty, but we're talking about him because it's kind of like we're putting this whole time period sort of like together. And but he was a highly influential doctor during this general period of time, and he wrote about acupuncture, herbal medicine, and he blended together many different ideas of Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism. And so when you read Sun Sumiao, you'll be able to see these ideas. They come to the forefront. They come through his writings. There's also another doctor. His name is Wang Bing. And one of the reasons why he's so important and worth mentioning, in my opinion, is that he puts together a very important and influential new version of the Neijing during this period. And this becomes the standard version that's basically passed down to us today. And so this is important because a lot of these classic old texts like the Neijing, Ling Shu, the Su Wen, there was no like industrial level printing press long ago in ancient China. Books often had to be copied by hand or through a very laborious printing process. And books were very precious. And as we saw during the Qin Dynasty, books would get burned, books would get destroyed. They were handed down as a lineage. So they were very rare. And it's not uncommon that classic books would get destroyed and lost throughout the ages. And this is the case for many important classic Chinese texts that get referenced in books. We read texts that reference other texts, and we don't have those texts. They're just no longer available to us. So it's actually very fortuitous and lucky that we're even able to read the Huangdi Neijing, that we're even able to read the Su Wen and the Ling Shu and all these classic texts about East Asian medicine and Chinese medicine we're super lucky that they exist. And one of the reasons that we get them in such a good, high quality and a good version of them is because this person, Wang Bing, put it together. He kind of reassembled it and created a new version of it. And that's actually, kind of like the main version that comes down to us today. When we read it, we're sort of reading the Wang Bing version of the Neijing. So it's just worth noting that. So speaking of Sun Simiao, who this very famous doctor of the Tang in the Sui and Tang dynasty, these are some great books that we can look at if we ever want to read his writings firsthand, right from the source. So one thing to know is Sun Simiao is a very important doctor on many levels in terms of medicine, but he also was revolutionary in terms of medical ethics. He wrote about the ethics of medicine, and many times people kind of call him the Hippocratic Oath. They'll say Sun Simiao is like the Hippocrates of East Asian medicine because he wrote so much about ethics. And Hippocrates is very famously known for the Hippocratic Oath, and that's an important medical ethical doctrine in Western medicine. And so there's this great book, Healing, Virtue, Power, Medical Ethics, and the Doctor's Tao by Sabine Wilms. She does great, these are all by her. She does great translation work, an extremely high quality scholar in translating classical Chinese texts and talking about classical Chinese medicine. So we also have the Beiji Qianjin Yao Fang, and this is essential prescriptions worth 1,000 in gold for every emergency. So this is another Sun Simiao text, and this is specifically 3 volumes on gynecology that she translated. So you can read Sun Simiao's writings on gynecology. And then you could read Venerating the Root, and this is a multi-part. This is just the first part, this cover here, but this is his writings on pediatrics. So this kind of exemplifies how Sun Simiao is writing about narrow, focused specialties in medicine. So now let's talk about Taoism. A little bit moving on from kind of the history specifically of the Tang Dynasty, let's talk about Taoism, because Taoism was a prominent philosophy during the Tang Dynasty. But even before the Tang Dynasty, Taoism was extremely influential, even though we haven't talked about it yet so much. Taoism was highly influential all throughout the Han Dynasty as well, and all of the time periods in between the Han and the Tang Dynasty, because Taoism emerged during the Warring States period. It was one of the main philosophical schools of the Warring States, which we talked about in a previous lesson. And so the founder, the mythical founder of Taoism, and the so-called author of the Tao Te Ching is Lao Tzu, and this is a picture of Lao Tzu. And then, of course, we have the yin-yang symbol, which is the archetypal symbol of harmony and balance and symbolic of Taoism and the philosophical ideas of Taoism. And this is the symbol that symbolizes the way, the Tao. The Tao is often translated as the way. And this is the archetypal symbol of Taoism. And as you know, as a Chinese medicine student, you would know the yin and yang is so important to East Asian medicine. It's at the absolute heart. It's the root. So Taoism, it originates in the Warring States period. It's a Chinese philosophy centered on living in harmony with the Tao, with the way. It's the ineffable. It's, in Taoism they speak of the Tao, but it's this ineffable, unconceptualizable, unexpressible concept. It's the natural force that governs the universe. It emphasizes principles of Taoism, such as Wu Wei, which is often translated as non-action or non-doing. Ziran, which is sort of like not naturalness or spontaneity. And then the balance of yin and yang, or the five phases, 5 elements, wuxing. And this is to achieve simplicity, spontaneity, unity with nature in the natural way, the natural world. It advocates for detachment from artificial desires and societal constructs. It promotes a life of effortless flow and inner peace. And this is exemplified in texts, Taoist texts like the Tao Te Ching, or other texts like Zhuangzi, and we're going to look at even more too. And in East Asian medicine, Taoism informs the holistic approach to health. It views the body as a microcosm of the universe where balance of qi and jing and shun. They align with the Tao's natural order to prevent and treat illness. So, um, and we're also going to talk about how this, like, how Taoism sort of differs from Confucianism in a little bit as well. So, but just to point you into some cool, great classical Taoist texts. I'm a real big fan of Taoism and just reading ancient Chinese philosophy. That's kind of like my background before I got into Chinese medicine and East Asian medicine. And I really love Taoism, and I just want to turn you all on to some great Taoist texts. Of course, you have the Tao Te Ching, and there's so many, many, many translations of the Tao Te Ching. And if you read the many translations, you'll know they differ quite a bit. So try out different translations of any ancient Chinese text. You'll find that there's a lot of differences. No translation is the same, and they all kind of reflect the translator in some form. But you have the Tao Te Ching. That's the number one most classic text of Taoism. But you also have the Zhuangzi, which is another amazing text of Taoism. Whereas the Tao Te Ching is sort of poetic, it's very mysterious, it's enigmatic. Uh, the Zhuangzi also has those qualities, but it's a much more like long, like a short stories of a way of writing. And Zhuangzi is a very creative kind of a writer and very cool stories in Zhuangzi. I definitely, if you like Taoism, I definitely recommend you got to read the Zhuangzi. If you love the Tao Te Ching, you got to read the Zhuangzi. But then you also have the Leizi and the Wunzi, and these are also really great Taoist books. I like the Leizi because it's sort of like little stories that exemplify the ideas in Taoism. They're very relatable. You can kind of just like read one, and it's like it sets your whole day off on a good note. And really great relatable Taoist stories in the Leizi. But then the Wenzi, once again, is another really great Taoist book, and I love this translation by Thomas Cleary. And you really get a sense of the naturalness and the kind of the Taoist how the Taoist way goes with just the natural world. It feels really like it's written by like a sage in a mountain somewhere. So I really love all of these books. I've read them all and I really appreciate them all. They're kind of books that I go back to every now and then. But I definitely recommend, if you love the Taoist ideas of harmony and yin and yang and flow and spontaneity and all these kinds of things that happen in East Asian medicine, I definitely recommend reading the classic books. Just like I think reading the Confucian Analects is really valuable. Reading these texts really kind of fleshes out the concepts and makes them open up and flower and really makes them kind of more personal and real. And it really helps us to understand how that happens in East Asian medicine as well. So definitely big fan and advocate of reading the ancient Taoist texts. So let's just briefly skim over and look at some ancient Taoism philosophy concepts, okay? So number one, probably the most important, you have the way, the Tao, as it's named after. And this is sort of the ineffable, eternal source of all existence. It's what guides natural processes. Living in alignment with the Tao, with the way, it brings harmony. That means you're living in a harmonious way. You're living in accordance with the natural laws of the universe. So it represents the ultimate reality. It's beyond human definition or control. And this is exemplified in the Tao Te Ching when they ask like, what's the Tao? And the Tao is what cannot be named. That's what Lao Tzu says. So it's unexpressible. It's ineffable. It's beyond human rationality, frankly. So it's a mystical concept. Then you have this concept called Zuran, which is sort of like naturalness or spontaneity, which is such a great thing. As an artist, I really appreciate this concept. I love being spontaneous and getting in a flow state. And that's sort of how I think about this. And so Zuran is like acting in accordance with your true nature, with the natural order. It's free from artificial constraints or forced efforts. You don't have to force things. They just flow. You're in a flow state. That's how I think about it. It emphasizes authenticity and spontaneous behavior that aligns with the Tao. And then you have Wu Wei, which is non-action, which is somewhat of a weird term. It's hard to translate. It's kind of strange at first for us. Like, what's non-action? It doesn't mean you're not doing anything, but it means that you're acting without force or interference. You're just allowing events to unfold naturally in harmony with the Tao. So maybe you're doing things, but they're natural things. They're spontaneous things. It's connected to Ziran in this way. So you're behaving in a spontaneous, natural, effortless way that's just very authentic, spontaneous, and not forced. It's not pure passivity. It's not like you're just sitting there doing nothing. You're doing things, but it's effortless. It's action that is effortless and unforced. It's like water flowing through obstacles. The water's not trying to flow, it's just flowing. So that's kind of the Taoist concept of Ziran and Wu Wei. So let's talk a little bit more about the way. According to Taoism, the way is ineffable, eternal source of all existence. It guides natural process, transcends human understanding, inexplicable generative force, seen as an ongoing process. It's happening right now as I'm talking to you. So in the Tao Te Ching, chapter 1, the very first part of the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu says, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. The named is the mother of 10,000 things. So the significance of this is that this opening passage of the Tao Te Ching defines the Tao as beyond definition. So imagine that. You're defining something, you're saying it can't be defined. It's kind of an enigma. And an ultimate reality that precedes and generates all existence. It emphasizes its mysterious, transcendent nature and sets the foundation for Taoist metaphysics. So let's just talk real quick about the Tao in relation to Confucians versus Taoists, because they both use the term, the Tao. Confucians also use that term. It's a term that they use to explain how they see the natural order to be. And so we talked about the Confucians in our previous lecture, and we know that the Confucians are all about ordering society. They have a very definitive idea of what is good and bad, right and wrong, upright or perverse. They have, in this way, they have this like very conservative, structured view of reality, because their ultimate aim is, like it says here, the correct manner of human coexistence in society. They think that everybody has a place in the order, in the hierarchy of the human society, and their ultimate goal is what's best for humans, what's best in the human world, human society, human government, human virtues, human morality. So the really like the axis mundi of their entire metaphysics is centered on humanity. And it's a very human oriented philosophy in that way. Whereas the Taoists have a different approach. And so even though they're talking about the Tao, they're talking about it much more from like a cosmic perspective. It's not rooted in humans. Humans are sort of incidental. We're not that important. We're just another piece of the puzzle of the grand scheme of things, the natural world, the cosmos, heaven and earth. And we're sort of like just another thing that's in there in the universe. And we have a way of behaving in concert with the ultimate Tao. So they would probably say that the Confucian Tao is sort of like, sort of artificial. It's like a small Tao. It's like it's not really the Tao. It's just the Confucian interpretation. It's because the Taoists are very critical of Confucians. They think that once you define right, you're also defining wrong. Once you define good, you're also defining what's bad. And so they're very critical of Confucian ethics and morality. They think that they're basically bringing in the opposite of whatever they're trying to create, just by virtue of what they're doing. The Taoists believe, because the Confucians are very much effortful, they're putting in effort. They're behaving in a way to effortfully administrate and organize the world according to their worldview. Whereas Taoists, as we just saw, are very much all about effortless action. Rather than forcing the world to accord with your worldview, you instead accord your behavior to the natural world itself, to the ultimate Tao, to the cosmic Tao, to the natural harmony of life. So it's kind of a different way of approaching the topic of Tao. And that's where the conflict sort of is between the Confucians and the Taoists. So the Taoists were not so much concerned with understanding of man himself as with knowledge of how man can best conform to the laws of nature. Confucius and his followers based their efforts to restore social order on the view that individual members of society no longer conducted their lives in accordance with the positions assigned to them by the feudal hierarchy. But it was the establishment of this hierarchy and the assignment of positions itself that Taoists considered the cause of all misfortune and decadence. So the Taoists saw Confucians sort of like these misguided bureaucrats, and they think that they just complicate the natural way of life with their hierarchies, their performative rituals, and what they saw as sort of like a hollow virtue. It's not authentic, it's sort of forced. So, just a couple more little segments on the way, little chapters that we can reference here. In chapter 25 of Lao Tzu of the Tao Te Ching, he says, "There was something formless and perfect before the universe was born. It's serene, empty, solitary, unchanging, infinite, eternally present. It's the mother of the universe. For lack of a better name, I call it the Tao." So the significance of this quote is that it describes the Tao as primordial, it's formless, it's the source of the universe, and it highlights the eternal, unchanging essence and role as the origin of all things. In the Zhuangzi, chapter 2, he says the Tao has its reality and its signs, but it's without action or form. You can hand it down, but you cannot receive it. You can get it, but you cannot see it. So this enigmatic language permeates all throughout Taoism, because they're talking about something that they cannot totally define, that they cannot totally express. And so Zhuangzi portrays the Tao as intangible, yet real, emphasizing its elusive nature and its presence in all things, encouraging intuitive alignment over intellectual grasping. So some other Taoist philosophy concepts we can talk about are, number one, the uncarved block. This symbolizes simplicity, purity, the original untainted state of being before societal or artificial influences. It represents returning to a natural, unadorned state of authenticity. Maybe you might talk about flow. It's like the effortless movement of the Tao, likened to water that adapts to its environment without resistance. It encourages flexibility and alignment with life's natural rhythms. Just like Bruce Lee says, he's like, be like water. So when he says that, he's saying something from a Taoist philosophy perspective. That's where that quote is coming from. We might also consider yin and yang as sort of like a Taoist concept, even though there was a yin and yang philosophical school of thought. In many ways, it kind of merged with Taoism sort of during the Warring States period. And so obviously we know about yin and yang. It's sort of the complementary interdependent forces that balance and shape the universe, and harmony arises from their dynamic equilibrium. And it reflects the cyclical, ever-changing nature of existence. It sort of is exemplifying the continual Tao itself. It's as the way progresses, it's like yin and yang gives rise to one another, and all of the changes of the universe just keep going on and on and on. So just to touch on the uncarved block real quick. The uncarved block is a Taoist philosophical concept, particularly in the Tao Te Ching. It symbolizes the original, untainted state of simplicity, authenticity, and naturalness before external influences or societal conditioning shape it. Representing pure potential in its essence of the Tao, it reflects a state free from artificial desires, complexities, or distinctions. It embodies humility and spontaneity, or Zuran. In practice, returning to the uncarved block means embracing simplicity, letting go of ego-driven ambitions, and aligning with the natural flow of the universe, a core Taoist ideal for achieving harmony. And also, it's sort of like the Taoists also say you want to be like an infant, you want to be like a child, the way that a child sees the world, the way that a baby behaves in the world is very close to being in harmony with the Tao. And so before maybe a child or an infant would be sort of like the uncarved block. They haven't had the concepts and impressions of life have not yet been imprinted onto them. Their ideas are still flexible, they're open, they're pure potential, basically. So then going back to our concept of Wu Wei, uh, let's see. Wu Wei, non-action, effortless action, achieving results by aligning with the Tao, the natural flow, not forcing it. In medicine, this Taoist concept of Wu Wei can be applied to one's lifestyle. By behaving according to the flow of life, the seasons, the world, one avoids disharmony and thus illness. In treatment, the physician who applies Wu Wei simply applies the treatment which corresponds to the pattern of disharmony and allows the body to correct itself naturally. We see these kinds of Wu Wei and Taoist ideas a lot in, for instance, like the Huangde Neijing in the Su Wen, where they talk about you want to behave this way during this season and this way during this season to go with the natural harmony of the season, the natural harmony of the environment. That's why the Huangde Neijing is thought to contain a lot of these Huang Lao concepts. It's very influenced by Taoism. They permeate these ancient classic books. And so whenever we talk about harmonizing, we might be talking in a way that's Taoist. Whenever we're doing things that go with the natural flow of the universe and the seasons and the environment, we're behaving in somewhat of a Taoist Huang Lao kind of way. So that's important to know because those ideas are everywhere in East Asian medicine. Zuran is nothing other than the earth, seen as a boundless generative organism, an ongoing total event. That's what David Hinton says. So Zuran can also be translated as self-so, the natural spontaneous naturalness, things unfolding without force, perfectly aligned with the Tao's inherent patterns. Zuran is basically Wu Wei in action, if you want to put it that way. And this is the Chinese seal form character of Zuran. Then we can talk about harmony. In Taoism, harmony refers to the balance, natural alignment of all things with the Tao, achieved through the interplay of yin-yang and the movement of the five phases. It emphasizes unity, balance, and effortless flow. Wu Wei, where opposites coexist without conflict. In Chinese medicine, He, or harmony, manifests as the balanced interaction of Qi, Jing, Shun, and all of the interconnected bodily systems where health reflecting harmony among organs, emotions, and the environment. Disharmony, marked by imbalances in yin-yang and wuxing, causes illness, requiring restoration through medical interventions and other natural means. So, according to the Taoists, disharmony occurs by being out of harmony with the world. If you're behaving the wrong way at the wrong time, doing the wrong thing in the wrong way, that is not in a natural way, you can cause harm. And so the Taoists go with the flow. They're not doing things, that are maybe like forced. They're not going where they're not supposed to be. They're not doing what they're not supposed to do. They're not, effing around and finding out. They're going with the flow. And that doesn't mean they're like completely like just pushovers. There's a time and a place for everything. But that's kind of the idea, is that you're going with the flow of the universe and you're doing what is right according to the cosmic harmony, which is a little bit different than the Confucian idea of what's right. So just to talk about the Taiji, which is the yin-yang symbol, the ultimate symbolism of yin-yang. Taiji is also called the supreme ultimate. That's the translation of Taiji. And it represented by the Taiji symbol showing a circle with interlocked black and white yin and yang halves, each with a dot in the other. That visualizes that within each ultimate there is also the emergence of the opposite, and it visualizes unity, balance, mutual independence. It's non-dualistic. It rejects dualism. Yin and yang are relative, not absolute, and they exist within a unified whole, which is the Tao. It encourages embracing both aspects without rigid categorization, which we all know Confucians love rigid categorization. And even though they, in some ways, this all becomes somewhat syncretically blended together in the medicine of systematic correspondences, because we start to classify everything in terms of yin and yang. So yin and yang, complementary opposites. Yin is dark, passive, feminine. Yang is bright, active, assertive, masculine. They're interdependent forces. They each contain the seed of the other. Neither superior, but they're both necessary for harmony. They're in dynamic balance. It represents a continual cyclical interplay where one force waxes, the other wanes, maintaining equilibrium. Balance is not static, it's a fluid process of adjustment. Interconnectedness, where all phenomena are interconnected through yin and yang, with each aspect influencing and defining the other. For example, cold exists relative to heat. They are exemplifications of yin and yang. And this just reflects the holistic nature of the universe, and as you know, this plays out in our medicine. The yin and yang also represents transformation and change. Yin and yang drives change as opposites transform into each other when one reaches its peak. Extreme yang becomes yin, embodies the Taoist view of reality as ever changing. And you can see this in even like acupuncture theory, for example. If you want to treat the yang, you treat the yin. If you want to treat the yin, you treat the yang. If you want to treat above, you treat below. If somebody has a headache up here, you do liver 3 down there. If you want to treat below, you do above. Left treats right, right treats left, etc., etc. There's lots of these examples in acupuncture. And it has a universal application because it applies to nature. So you have the earth versus the sky. You have human life. You have rest versus activity. In society, there are yielding versus assertive forces. And it guides balance in all domains, essentially. And it influences Chinese medicine, where health depends on balancing yin and yang energies. And as we know, we have the yin and yang correspondences. And we're all quite familiar with these at this point, but just to run through them very briefly. Yang, exterior, movement, sunlight, hard. Qi, the defensive qi, the superficial layer, the exterior is yang. It has to do with functioning, energy, so like the functions of organs and bodily systems are somewhat yang concepts. It's immaterial. It has to do with heat, it's dry, it's fire, it's heaven, it's masculine principle. Whereas the yin is the opposite. It's the interior, it's the stillness, the softness, the shade. It's the blood level, it's the nutritive qi, it's the deep layer. It's the substance and the form as opposed to the function. It's the material, it's the cold, the damp, the water, the earth, and the feminine. Taoist principles are also relative. They embrace relativity because obviously yin and yang exemplifies that. So it's a very hyper-relativistic philosophy, for better or worse. Some people don't like that. Other people do. Other people are drawn to that. Sometimes that's appropriate, maybe. Sometimes that's not. You know, some people argue that hyper-relativism leaves us into nowhere. You know, if you can't say that something is good or bad, that is almost could be, you know, that would be a Confucian maybe criticism of the Taoists. It's like if you can't even say that something so obviously bad is bad, if you're so lost in moral relativism, that could be a criticism that gets levied perhaps by the Confucians against the Taoists. So it goes both ways. They can both criticize one another. Maybe the Confucians would say, well, the Taoists, they have no spine. They don't stick to a place of moral conviction, whereas the Confucians are very clear. They're like, no, this is right, this is wrong. But the Taoist philosophy is very relative because it's a philosophy of flow. It's a philosophy of yin and yang. So they have the perspective that distinctions such as good and bad and big and small, these are all relative, they're subjective. And this is seen, for example, in a very famous story from the Zhuangzi. He has this butterfly story where he's like having this dream of being a butterfly, and then he wakes up and he's like, I don't know if I was the butterfly or if I'm Zhuangzi. Which one is the real me? Was it the me in the dream that I was having, or is it me now that I'm awoken? There's many stories from Zhuangzi which kind of has this idea of relativity, you know, where you know there's a like a cockroach or a cricket on the ground, and it sees this gigantic bird flying above, and it's like what is it doing up there? And it's just the idea that, like, you know, what do tiny small things know about very big large things, and vice versa. There's all of these very, really cool stories of relativity in the Zhuangzi. It's really just an amazing book. Um, Simplicity, advocating for minimalism and humility to avoid complicating life with desires or ambitions that disrupt natural harmony, promotes living modestly in tune with the Tao simplicity. So maybe like a Taoist isn't going to be like driving the Lambo, you know. He's not maybe uh, showing off all of his wealth real flashy, you know, wearing like all the Gucci and the Prada and all that kind of stuff. He's living very minimally. He's like, I got my one bowl here, I got my nice spoon, I got my good cup, and that's pretty much all I need. I'm good for now. I just got my handy chopsticks, and you know, I just got what I need to do what I got to do to be in harmony with the Tao to live authentically. He doesn't. The Taoist is very humble and simple and modest. In some ways, they agree with the Confucians. The Confucians aren't really big about wealth and luxury and money either. Uh, as far as detachment, the Taoist philosophy is all about letting go of the ego and desires and attachments. It achieves inner peace and alignment with the Tao's natural flow. It emphasizes freedom from worldly concerns to attain spiritual clarity. In many ways, perhaps that might overlap with Buddhist ideas. And so that's why in the Tang Dynasty, you know, they kind of see Buddhism as sort of like this perversion of Taoism, maybe at points in time. Some people might levy that criticism because there's a lot of overlap between some of the metaphysical concepts of Taoism and Buddhism. And so that's just, you know, like the Venn diagram of these three philosophies. They overlap and they don't overlap in ways. But in ancient Chinese society, they were very much blending in a syncretic matter. How does Taoism relate to acupuncture and herbalism? Well, you want to be in harmony with the Tao. Taoism teaches that alignment with the natural order with the Tao parallels Chinese medicine's focus on harmonizing the body's qi with natural rhythms to promote health. They both view health and life as flowing naturally when aligned with universal principles. The balance of yin and yang. Taoism's concept of yin and yang as complementary forces shaping the universe is central to Chinese medicine, which diagnoses and treats imbalances in yin and yang to restore bodily harmony. So they both emphasize dynamic balance as essential for well-being or cosmic order. They both emphasize non-action in Wu Wei. Taoism's Wu Wei principle aligns with Chinese medicine's preference for gentle, minimally invasive treatments like acupuncture or herbal remedies that guide the body back to its natural state. They both advocate working with, not against, natural process to achieve results, or even being preventative. Maybe they don't even have to treat the issue because they've prevented it in the first place. The Taoist herbalists were very much about taking medicinal substances that nourish their qi and their blood and their jing so that they age gracefully. They age into very, very old, healthy people, and they don't get sick because they've protected their qi and they've lived in harmony. The holistic perspective is that Taoists view all existence as interconnected. It mirrors Chinese medicine's holistic approach. Which treats the body as an integrated system of organs, qi, acupuncture meridians, rather than isolated, distinct parts. So they both emphasize the interdependence of all the elements within a larger system. Naturalness, Zuran, Taoist emphasis on spontaneity and naturalness corresponds to Chinese medicine's focus on aligning lifestyle, like diet, exercise, with the natural cycles, like the seasons, with the day and the night to prevent disease, or even with the moon cycles. Both value living in accordance with nature's rhythms of yin and yang and wuxing for optimal functioning. Flow and fluidity. Taoism likens Tao to water, flowing effortlessly and adapting to circumstances, similar to Chinese medicine's concept of qi, flowing smoothly through the meridians to maintain health. Blockages in qi is a disease. It's like rigid societal actions in Taoism. They disrupt natural flow and require correction. Prevention over cure. Taoism encourages simplicity and moderation to avoid disrupting the Tao, paralleling Chinese medicine's focus on preventative care through balanced living to maintain health before illness arrives. Both prioritize long-term harmony over radical reactive interventions. So let's talk real quick about the development of herbalism and drug therapy, which is a topic that is prominent in this week's reading material for Unshawled. Uh, Herbal medicine and drug therapy developed more along Taoist naturalist lines at first. The Taoists were drawn to alchemy, they were drawn to experimenting with herbs. So, the most important advancements in herbal medicine, in my opinion, number one, you have the Shenong Ben Sao Jing. That's kind of like the root of herbal medicine. We mentioned that in our Han Dynasty lecture. Then you have the Shanghan Lun by Zhang Zhangjing. Written during the Han Dynasty, it becomes highly revered in the Tang and the Song Dynasty, perhaps the most important herbal medicine text of all time, frankly. And then later, which we're going to cover, we're going to talk about the Song Jin Yuan medical advancements during the Song Dynasty. That's going to be lesson 10 coming up soon. This is when herbal medicine truly becomes systematized in the fashion of the medicine of systematic correspondences. But it wasn't always like that. It wasn't always fully systematized, classified. Everything wasn't understood completely like that. At some point, it was just developing from Taoists experimenting. That's really what Shenong Ben Sao is all about. The mystical story of him just walking around, trying all the herbs, seeing what they do, right? Maybe that's kind of like a Taoist way to learn about herbs. So why did the Taoists gravitate to the herbal medicine? Well, Confucianism advocated the strict classification of each individual member of society into a rigid and normative social structure, and the Confucian worldview likened the preservation of individual health with adherence to socio-politically motivated codes of conduct. In opposition to this view, the Taoists strive for a liberation of the individual from such social obligations. Taoists were often hermits. They were recluses. They would leave society and they would go live on their own, maybe in the mountains, maybe in somewhere where they didn't have to deal with all of the drama and the hubbub and the hullabaloo. So, in a way, herbal medicine and drug therapy offered the Taoists another form of longevity and healing divorced from Confucian social norms and conduct. The Taoists are well known for the herbal medicine experimentation, the alchemy, and also the yang sheng, the qigong and the tai chi and the martial art and breath work types of longevity interventions. So just to recap, we covered the Shenong Ben Sao, this same slide, in our Han Dynasty lecture. But just to say again, this was just such an important, innovative text, and it exemplifies sort of how the Taoists used herbal medicine in the beginning. This is like the very first systemization and classification of herbal medicine, but really it kind of came about by somebody just experimenting. Guys in the woods, in the mountains, just eating herbs, just trying them out. But I like to think of the Shenong Ben Sao as sort of like the DNA of Chinese pharmacology. Without it, there would be no one being able to make herbal formulas because you would not be able to know what all the herbs do. Then you have the Shanghan Lun, which becomes extremely important during the Tang Dynasty and soon during the Song Dynasty. And once again, this is written by Zhang Zhangjing. Talks about the 6-channel diagnostic system, which is super important even for acupuncturists. But this is like the root book for like making herbal formulas. Some of the most important formulas in this book. And this is the first clinical playbook. So it combined raw drugs into precise, logical, reproducible treatments. It's like herbal strategies. This is the first strategy book for herbal medicine where Zhang Zhangjing was like a genius. He like very masterfully, strategically put together herbs into these extremely complex and simplistic and thoughtful, rational formulas to treat what he diagnosed in his book. And it's such an awesome book. Let's talk about the 6 stages of disease. So in the Shanghan Lun, really one of the most influential parts of the Shanghan Lun is how it describes the natural progression of externally contracted cold diseases through the channels. Because the Shanghan Lun is cold, the theory of cold disease. Shanghan is injury by cold. So it's all about external cold attacks. They're coming from outside, they're attacking your body, and he's saying this is how things go when that happens. This is the progression of disease from the outside in. And so this is one of the most important theories of herbal medicine for herbal medicine training. It's basically the basis of the reasoning and the rationale for all the Shang Hunlun formulas. And so this is such a helpful little picture here, but this is going to be in our reading this week, or in our, maybe it was in the Han Dynasty lecture, where we're gonna we're gonna look at the introduction of the Shang Hunlun, and that's what this is taken from. It's a handy little chart, but it talks about the way that the presentation of each stage of disease happens. So the Tai Yang is gonna, like a Tai Yang disease is going to present differently than a Yang Ming disease or Xiao Yang disease, or a Tai Yin, Xiao Yin, or Zhui Yin disease. They all have a different way that they present themselves. And even if we're not talking about herbal medicine, this is applicable to acupuncture too. Somebody might come in with a Xiao Yang sort of presentation, and I'm going to treat the Xiao Yang with acupuncture. If somebody comes in with a Yang Ming presentation, I'm going to treat the Yang Ming, because this goes for acupuncture too. But he was very focused on herbal medicine. That's where he made his contributions, but the theory crosses the boundaries to acupuncture as well. Let's just real quick talk about a formula which really represents how Taoist ideas penetrated into herbal medicine theories and herbal medicine formulas. So in our previous Confucius lecture, we talked about how Confucianism kind of influenced herbal medicine theories. You had we talked about some herbal medicine formulas like Sujunzi Tang that had the concept of junzi in it and the idea of tonifying the upright qi. Well, Xiaoyaosan, which is probably like the most used formula, maybe overused, some say. I see people say that sometimes, but to be honest, I use it all the time. It's really just like a great formula for so many modern issues. But Xiaoyaosan, exemplary formula, used all the time in modern East Asian medicine practice, is somewhat representative of Taoist ideas, because Xiaoyaosan, the words Xiao Yao, they come from Zhuangzi, from the book Zhuangzi. There's a chapter in Zhuangzi called Free and Easy, Wandering Free and Easily. It's really just a reference to the Zhuangzi book. That's what it's named after. The whole formula is named after this chapter, this beautiful, amazing chapter in Zhuangzi. And not many people understand that, and they should go read Zhuangzi, because it's like, if you want to know about Xiaoyaosan, go read Zhuangzi, because there's a whole chapter that this formula is named after. So the function of the formula, and this is taken from this article, What's in a Name? Free and Easy Wanderer's Powder, from ITM Online, and I think that's in our lesson materials this week. The function of the formula is to help overcome the ingrained personal approach of clashing with rather than flowing around a difficulty that is encountered. So, after we just talked endlessly almost about all these Taoist concepts, it's like that really hits the nail on the head there, right? Like, of these Taoist ideas, being embodied by an herbal formula. It's about, instead of forcing and being, acting with force, you're now acting with forcelessness, with wu wei. It's about, Xiaoyaosan is like, how do we make this person wu wei, not act? How do we make them be effortless and fluid and dynamic? The broad applications listed for Xiaoyaosan can be understood in terms of its objective: treating a fundamental underlying disorder, which is the obstructed flow of qi that results from certain mental processes. The mind that has not learned how to face problems effectively, that struggles, strives, and competes, will cause the body's qi to stagnate, which over time yields various symptoms and diseases. The solution on the mental level is to study, understand, and apply the teachings of the Tao. On the physical level, the solution is to gently promote the smooth circulation of qi, which is what this formula does. So it's about going with, not going against. In acupuncture theory, sometimes this idea is also applied to needling techniques. Sometimes we insert the needle in a way where it's going with the flow of the meridian, or in terms of the 5 phases, we might follow the pathway or cycle of the 5 phases. And so you have these ideas of supplementation or tonification. And we spoke about the mother-child relationships and the different ways that we can leverage the 5 phases in terms of whether we want to tonify something or sedate something in an excess or a deficiency condition. So we might think about this in terms of Taoism. You know, we're either going with or we're going against. And they talk about that a lot in the old Chinese texts, you know, the going with the qi or going against the qi, intercepting it or helping it to go away or something like that. You know, there's all these different ways that they speak about it. So inserting the needle in a way where it is going against the flow of the meridian or the 5-element cycle has been described as a method of drainage or reduction. So you can go with to tonify or you can go against to drain. I wanted to just briefly mention the Zhuangzi's butcher story, which I think it's linked in our lesson materials this lesson, and it's a story about going with the flow, and it's about practicing in harmony with the Tao. And so in it, it says a good cook changes his knife once a year because he cuts. A mediocre cook changes his knife once a month because he hacks. And so Zhuangzi's butcher story is just like one of my favorite Taoist stories. It's about this master butcher Ding. He carves an ox effortlessly by following the natural joints, the Tao, not forcing his blade. It glides. For 19 years he does this without it ever even dulling because he's just so in tune with the Tao and the natural flow of the creatures and the oxen that he's butchering. And the moral is that the moral is really like going with effortless action, going with the flow, with Wu Wei. It's aligning with nature's patterns for mastery. It's about force is destructive, but intuition is what preserves. And so we're all going to be reading the Taoist butcher story of Zhuangzi this lesson in our materials. Let's just mention also the topic of Jing real quick, which is kind of a Taoist topic because the Taoist hermits and the alchemists and the herbal practitioners that were practicing in the mountains and the woods or wherever were trying to preserve their Jing. That's the longevity practices. I like to think of Jing as the potential inherent to any living organism. It's sort of like the, sometimes we think of it as sort of like your genetics or your DNA, which is sort of maybe okay, but not really quite accurate. But it's really like, it's like your potential at any given moment. And you want to store up potential. You want to store up like what you're capable of doing. You want to have maximum potentiality. That's how I think of Jing. And so Taoist life preservation techniques focus on preserving the Jing. It's like preserving your potential. And so if you have tons and tons of potential, it's like you're not going to be sick because you have the potential to be all sorts of states in terms of, and most of them are healthy states. So I think that's how I think of potential. So it's translated as essence, but I think of it as potential, as Jing. But that's just me. So in TCM, Jing is like the fundamental life substance. It is a substance in a sense in TCM. It's the root of physical form and reproduction, stored in the kidneys as prenatal, inherited from parents, postnatal. It can be developed from the things we eat, from the spleen qi, turning it into Jing. Classical character evokes refined or pure extract, the actual character itself. And it represents the most concentrated qi that condenses into things like marrow, bones, brain, hair, teeth, reproductive fluids. Jing governs growth, development, reproduction, aging. When it's sufficient, it ensures vitality, like healthy puberty or fertility. When it's deficient, it causes decline. You can become infertile. You can have weakness in your knees or your low back. You might prematurely gray. There might be issues like dementia in later life. So unlike dynamic qi or shen, Jing is relatively fixed or static, but it's also conserved through moderation. And it's tonified through things like kidney tonifying herbs, maybe like Rogue Wei or Futsa. People might theorize that that could be a way to tonify the Jing. Or maybe other things like Romania, or there's a variety of different herbs that the Taoist mystics would use as longevity herbs. But basically, health equals Jing preservation, and it's a long life without decay if you preserve your Jing. And that leads us to talk about just an important topic in East Asian medicine called Yang Sheng. And that means nourishing life. And that encompasses, it's like an umbrella term that encompasses a bunch of different practices. But Sun Simiao is one of the most important figures when it comes to Yang Sheng. Yang Sheng is like medicalization of Taoist longevity practices for the masses. So Yang Sheng in Taoism or TCM means nourishing life. It's the Taoist derived practice of preserving Jing to extend vitality, delay aging, align with the Tao's natural flow. It's rooted in Zhuangzi's Wu Wei. With Jing, it's the fixed essence of the kidneys, as we just said. It's the fuel for growth and reproduction. It depletes via overwork, over too much sex, too much excessive emotions. Yang Sheng practices conserve Jing, and that sustains your qi. It sustains your shun, and so, like I said, health is Jing, long life without decay, and there are various practices for this. Number one, you might do qigong or taiji, and that's like the slow breathing, the movement exercises. You might perform dietary practices, which are warming. That might nourish your qi and your jing and your blood. Things like goji berries, black beans. The Taoists have sexual practices, which I'm not going to go into, but that is just a theory from ancient Chinese East Asian medicine. They develop a lot of those things as sort of longevity practices, but I'll leave that up to you to decide. There's also meditation practices such as quiet sitting and Neidan. And then there's herbal remedies such as Shudi Huang or Rogue Wei. But the overall idea is that Taoist medicine cultivates Jing. And just like Zhuangzi's butcher follows the joints and Wu Wei, it's an effortless preservation and it creates a sage-like longevity. And his knife never dulls if you conserve your potential, if you follow the flow. And I would recommend these two books as some useful Yang Sheng books. You have this one by Richard Bertschinger, which goes into a lot of like movement therapy kind of things, and it's a great book on Yang Sheng and self-care. This is a great picture from an old ancient text. And then you have Live Long, Live Well, which is by Peter Deadman, and this is his text on all the teachings from the Chinese nourishing of life tradition. So, in conclusion, thank you for listening to this long lecture. Taoism is a philosophy that exerted important influences on East Asian medicine and culture as a whole. The Tang Dynasty was a time when Taoist influence became more prominent, and this can be seen in areas such as Yang Sheng and nourishing life practices, herbal medicine. It's exemplified by the works of Sun Simiao. Taoism was particularly important for the early development of herbal medicine and drug therapy, but understanding the basics of Taoist philosophy can help us tap into and see its influences in East Asian medicine, as well as understand these concepts on a much deeper level. So I definitely recommend passively reading Taoist texts, classical Taoist texts. They're so nourishing. They're written so beautifully. They're so relevant. They're timeless. They're timeless classics. You can read them even more than once in your life, and they sort of unfold as time goes on. The more you read them, you can read it one day, and then 5 years later, read it again, and you're learning all new lessons that weren't there the first time. They're really those kinds of books, and I highly recommend them. And I think, later in your life, in your career as an acupuncturist and an herbal medicine practitioner, when you're looking for new things to dig into and get inspiration from, why not crack open a book from the ancient Chinese classics, and for instance, like Zhuangzi or the Lao Tzu, the Tao Te Ching, and they will nourish your practice. They will nourish your ideas, and I just think that's a great way to continue your lifelong education as well. So that's our presentation for this lesson, Taoism, and I will be back next time for a lesson, probably a shorter lesson on Buddhism. So thank you, everybody, and have a great week.